Welcome to Portals of Perception. We are delighted you have found us. You can join the Portals of Perception network on the site by subscribing and becoming a member. And you can attend one of our events. You can like us in all media channels, and you're welcome to share our posts with others. Become part of a global network that explores all sorts of fascinating questions at this time. Thank you. The Portals of Perception inquiry centers on how the world is changing and how we humans evolve with our consciousness, values, and beliefs. Today's conversation brings to focus the shift underway for humanity at large. I'm here with Yair Rasul, an author of The Drive, a prize-winning novel, and a columnist for Haaretz, the leading paper in Israel, often described as the New York Times of Israel. Yair won the Israel's Ministry of Culture Prize, the Sapir Prize, and he was awarded the Prime Minister's Prize for Authors. In his thought-provoking columns, he describes the tectonic shift underway and the developments accelerating now. We want to explore all these deeply. Yair, it's good to have you here. Welcome.
It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Let me ask you first, how do you describe the broader areas of interest and the core inquiries that propel your work and the columns you write?
I would describe it as my project is to understand societies, companies, and individuals' consciousness. I'm curious about consciousness, the idea of consciousness. I think this is what makes us human beings, the concept of living inside of subjective story. This is what I'm trying to understand, and this is my project in any fields, in my novels, in my column, when I teach. It's all part of my journey to understand the ways the consciousness work.
Beautiful, and we will want to circle back to that, the inner journey inside the broader, a greater journey. Let me go, nevertheless, directly to the column you published this week. And you titled it, "The World Needs Another Flood." My question is, how do you mean this? Because I perceive the idea of the flood, whether metaphorically or actual, to represent a major recast, a reorganizing event, perhaps an absolution and a release of the past. How do you mean this idea that we now need a new flood?
I totally agree with you. I mean, the idea of flood, I don't know, some generations it's changing according to the times. We have some kind of flood, some kind of a big paradigm shift, big change that actually erase or delete the non-relevant ideas, things, power, etc., and create a new story. This is what I mean with that we need a flood. I mean, we are in times of huge changes, and the flood is only the power who cleans the non-relevant things and actually give us the opportunity to create new ideas or things, or eventually a new story, a new theory.
So you are imagining either practically or a metaphoric and or very actual, some kind of a expunging event that will release us from the carryover of history that we no longer need in the face of the challenges we are facing today.
So I don't think that flood, it's a one specific event or a one big tragedy. I mean, it's a state of mind of flood. As I wrote in the text, we have to understand that something fundamental is changing, that something fundamental is no longer relevance. The story that we tell, we talked about consciousness, the story that we tell to ourselves about our reality is not the right story anymore. We have to create a new story. This is actually the deep sense of flood, because if we think about the biblical story, God actually looked at the world and said, I failed. I must create a new world, a new context, a new situation. And this state of mind of flood is something that I believe that we need it. And if we won't accept it or won't agree with this idea, I think eventually it will come one way or another, and then it will be a real tragedy.
Was there a specific catalyst for this, Callum?
In Israel, last week was a very dramatic week, not in the big issues, but in the small existential issues. Murder here, some terror attack of Jews against Arab there. I mean, I felt that we're no longer moved by ideas or ideology or even human emotions, but the animal side of the human being raised his head. And I said, this is, again, like the biblical story, this is a time when you understand that something really doesn't work.
So let's use this starter to trace the bigger arc that you are observing. How do you tell the high-level story of the last few centuries?
So I see it. I don't think that it's not only in the last centuries. I think it's how the humanity works. I mean, as I said before, I think that human beings really create when they start to understand that they are not only the heroes of the big story that God created or whatever, they can be the one who tells a story. This is when humanity really begins. We start to create stories. I think that in this moment, when we start to create stories, we start this cycle that we create stories, we believe in the stories, they're relevant to our life, and then after 1 generation, 10 generations, it's changing according to any story, it starts to crumble. It's no longer relevant. It's not reflecting our existential life, etc. And then the old stories start to crumble and a new story start to create. This is what I call the times of how. I mean, there is two kinds of times. The times of what? It's that we all know the rules. We all know that we play basketball. And then you have to ask only what I have to do to win the game, because I know what is a game. But in times of how, we no longer know how to act. We no longer understand the rules. We don't have the language to understand what's going on around us. And in times like this is time that, as I said, the whole story is crumbling, is no longer relevant. And we're in a kind of embarrassment. We're afraid, we don't know what to do. It's really interesting times, because in times like this, we can see how stories create, how ideologies create. And I think we're in a very tragic and full of opportunities, the time that we're living in.
What, in your observation, happened at the end of the 19th century, where you say that time made the sovereign state godly, or gave the state the role of God, which you then describe was a main character of the story we played in throughout the 20th century?
Yes, so this is what I call the age of politics, the age of the nation state. And I think it starts in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the whole idea of Industrial Revolution gave human beings the sense that they can be God. They can put the nation state, I mean, in America, it's a bit different, but the European idea of the nation state, it's based on the idea that we replace God by the state. Everything that we thought that God has to do, now the state has to give us, and we Like with the relations to God, we give our lives and the state give us all the other benefits. And I think that this story begins at the end of the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution and with the fundamental changes that are the existence of human being had. I mean, so I think this is what I think about the 19th century in this perspective.
And then you observe that with those extraordinary powers given to the state, we see on the world stage leaders like FDR, like Reagan, later Clinton, where essentially they're driven by the belief, the conviction that they, in those offices, in this role, can architect and re-architect the world and shape reality. But the core observation you make in several of your columns is that politics no longer does that, and that politics appear to now be playing a defensive game or a damage control game. So what is it? What is the exterior shift in the way you tell the story, and where do we find ourselves because of that?
So I think it's a question of relevance. When you're relevant, you try to make the world better. I mean, in the 20th century, politics were relevant. The story of the age of politics, people believed in, people moved by the story. And in this kind of time, politics try to, as you said, shape the world, create a new and better world, etc. Any old story, and the age of politics, it's only one story, but when the story become less and less relevant, meaning people less and less believe in the story or moved by the story, then the order starts to move from a relations based on relevance to relations based on power. The old order, which is something that we have to remember, the contradiction between old order and new order. The old order tried to stop the train from moving, try to stop the changes. And this is what we see about politics today. I mean, in the 20th century, politics were the new power who tried to shape a new world, as we know. In nowadays, we see politics as a power tried to stop from changing to actually creating a new order.
If you need to give a short name to the 19th century and then to the 20th century, what are the names you give to these centuries?
So I don't have a specific name, but I can define the 19th century, as I said, a century of the how, and the 20th century as a century of the what. In a lot of ways, we are much more alike today to the 30s of the 19th century and not to the 20th century. A lot of people like to compare us to these times to the 30s of the 20th century, but actually we're in the 30s of the 19th century, which is a big technological revolution, and of course, as an outcome, a huge existential revolution, which creates a huge, deep, and very exciting and also tragic consciousness revolution.
And your core observation there is that the shifts that were underway in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, brought the powers to be to a point of irrelevance, and that led to the kind of tectonic shift that played then, and that we are in a similar way corresponding with a similar change today.
Of course, because we have to remember that the idea of order is to order the world, is to order all the different consciousness that walking in the story. This is the idea of every story. When I write a novel, what is a novel? Is a way to order all the characters in the story to tell the story that I want them to tell. And when the consciousness of the characters is changing, the order is changing. This is a rule that we must remember as I see it. I mean, when the existence of the people is changing, the story is changing. The order must be changed. And in days like ours, what we see is a new consciousness and an old story. A new consciousness, but we still live in old terms. The examples that I really love to give is the story of the iPhone, which some people call it a telephone, right? But it's not a telephone, it's something totally different. The idea of autonomous car. It's not a car, it's something very, very different. But we still don't have the right language to describe what's going on, so we're still using an old language, which is not relevant anymore, and it creates a weird and even dangerous gaps between what we think and the way we experience the world and the way we talk about the world. And I think it will change, but we're in this process.
So we need a new language, we need a new story, we need a new interpretation, because that's how we catch up to the developments and the changes all around us.
Yes, as Ludwig Wittgenstein said, the limit of the language is the limit of the thought. I mean, we can really think deeply about what's going on now if we want to create a relevant language. We want to be able to create a new story if we want to understand that the old story is not relevant anymore. I mean, it's what I call the first step. There is 3 steps, as I describe it, in order to survive and grow. And the first step is a self-cannibalism. We have to take off from ourselves the old things that we believe that we are them, but we are not them. It's only one implication that we had, but it's not the only. This is not what we are. We have to create a new story.